Good work, Lang. Congratulations.
I only followed your teachings. When you stand once more on the platform, the living proof of your own triumph, the whole world will pay you homage.
Never.
When they see, they will have to believe.
They won't come to learn, only to stare. I'll be a freak in a sideshow. Lazarus II. 50 cents to look, $1 to touch.
Please, Doctor, you must rest.
Yes, I must rest. Gain strength and power for what I have to do.
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I am your host, Ian Garcia, and joining me as always is my father, Rocco.
Hello.
So now that we've finished a survey of the 1940s Universal horror films, we're going to take a sort of soiree into some other studios. Previously, I had put up a poll for the patrons about what they would like to see us do next. One of the options was for Val Lewton's filmography for RKO Radio Pictures, but in the end, ultimately it turned out what our patrons wanted to hear more about was Boris Karloff's career for Columbia Pictures. Now, Boris Karloff is in a very interesting situation in the mid to late 30s. More or less what happens is that, after being in Frankenstein and The Mummy, he's a big marquee star for Universal, and there's a sort of contract dispute that occurs between him and Carl Laemmle Jr. Basically what happened was that they were prepared to sign Karloff to a 6-month contract with a option to renew, where part of the contract would be that he would get a salary raise with the renewal of his option. But being the kind of stand-up guy that he was able to observe that the financial situation at Universal wasn't really stellar. So the first time he got his contract renewed, he agreed to waive a salary increase as long as the subsequent renewal of that contract would be for double. In other words, that he would be compensated for that waiving of a salary increase by twice the salary increase for the next option. So the next option came around. Carl Laemmle Jr., because this wasn't in writing, he reneged on the agreement, and ultimately Karloff sort of ended his exclusive relationship with Universal, took his freelancing elsewhere. And so well between the 35 and 1939, he's pretty much his own independent agent at this point. He doesn't do a lot of big mainstream movies, but he's nonetheless, at this point, Karloff is probably the biggest horror star of all of the age. He's very well known not only for his film work, but also being in regular demand on radio performances. He's also, of course, he ends up being very successful in the play version of Arsenic and Old Lace. He makes a lot of money doing that. So he's a very accomplished and successful actor at this time. And eventually in the year 1939, he goes to work under contract for Columbia, basically to make a string of movies that all ultimately, and this is going to be the interesting thing about exploring this part of Karloff's career for Columbia, because more or less all of the films that we're going to be exploring are going to be centered around a very similar theme. The plots are going to be very template oriented. They're all going to be basically casting Boris Karloff in the role of a sort of mad doctor. These movies are known as the Mad Doctor series. They're not movies that are connected by a franchise. He's not playing the same exact character in each film, but they're nonetheless sort of viewed in retrospect as being part of a series of films that are all sort of capitalizing on Karloff's star status as an icon of horror, and using that, at a studio like Columbia, being not one of the bigger studios in Hollywood, but also not necessarily being as cheap as a lot of the Poverty Row studios. These are basically B programmer films. And so I'm preparing the listener for the fact that of the 5 films that he makes for Columbia during this time, from the 1939 through the mid-40s, I'm just preparing my listeners to the fact that all of these movies are going to have very similar plots, have Karloff in very similar roles. So I'm almost hesitant and wondering how much we're going to be able to actually get into and explore about these movies.
Other than the writing, right? And dialogue.
Yeah, and I mean,
scripts and things like that, right?
Yeah, I think, yeah. So with this first film out of the gate, The Man They Could Not Hang, obviously this is not to be confused with another film which was from the 1920s, which was itself based on a play called The Man They Could Not Hang, which is about a very famous prisoner who, it's based on a real life story about a man who was sentenced to death and who was hung 3 times, but each time the hanging didn't work, and so he had his sentence commuted to life in prison. This is not the same story of The Man They Could Not Hang. This is a completely original production about a scientist who develops a revolutionary method for doing surgery, and ultimately finds himself being made a villain and a pariah for his work, and ultimately seeks to take revenge on those who...
Retribution.
Yeah, retribution on those who wronged him. Yeah. So before I get into the synopsis, which will be relatively simple, this movie, again, it's interesting coming off of the Universal films, because Universal being a bigger studio than Columbia, even their B movies were much more expensive and even lavish to a certain extent than Columbia's output at the time. And obviously with the Universal films, we were viewing a kind of more top-line marquee element of their output. They obviously put out much cheaper movies during that time, including like the Mummy films or movies that didn't have a marquee monster in them during the 1940s. But nonetheless, there's a certain prestige to those movies, and even for how often underwhelming they could be, there's definitely a sort of ambition that I think when we watch something like The Man They Could Not Hang, which is a movie that this is definitively, much more definitively than the Universal films we watch. This is a definitive B horror programmer. And I think the one that it's most similar to of the films we've seen previously is probably the Raven starring Bela Lugosi. Simply in terms of how not just the running time of the movie, I mean it's barely over an hour long, but just in terms of the small bore low stakes of the narrative, the very tight plotting of the movie around a very simple premise. And I think that's the thing, is that with a B programmer, there's this element to it where you can't really expect much from it production-wise. So so one of I think the tests of a B movie of this sort of more definitive kind is often going to be the way in which the writer or the production team simply tries to use the limited resources they have at their disposal to create something that's a little ingenious in a more subtle way. And I think comparing The Man They Could Not Hang to something like The Raven, another very similar story about a sort of mad doctor who turns his house into a a den of horrors with these torturous, deadly contraptions that he uses to inflict agony upon his victims. I think The Man They Could Not Hang in general is a much more interesting version of that same storyline. And I guess just in general, before I get into the plot synopsis, what were your sort of feelings about The Man They Could Not Hang?
I liked it. I mean, I know I never saw it, so I remember seeing the beginning maybe, and as a kid you lose interest in it because there's no more real monsters or things going on.
Yeah, the setup takes a remarkable amount of the very short running time of the movie. You know, it's like it's a good...
It's really tight.
Yeah, it's a good half hour before anybody is killed on screen. Well, killed maliciously on screen.
Yeah, the whole thing build up to it. There's a whole trial. I mean, the whole trial scene. Some of the dialogue in the beginning is kind of hammy, but aside from that, it really, especially when he does his monologues.
Yeah,
he's really good at what he does. He has a major speaking role in this film. And it goes on for quite a long time in some of these monologues. So I really have to hand it to him.
Yeah, like there's a whole courtroom drama element. Like the first act of the movie really is more of a legal drama than it is part of a horror movie. Yep. And that is the thing, is like, as a sort of B programmer, the movie does at the very least seem to try, or at least the writer of the movie, Carl Brown, does seem to try to seriously gesture at questions of scientific ethics and what like the role of medical science should be in progressing the capacity of human society to extend life and to improving quality of life, versus the alternative idea of is all science, including medical science, doomed to be used for nefarious purposes? Is there always going to, and is there also this more basic ethical question of who do we decide gets to make these revolutionary changes, and how much freedom do we offer the individual in sort of going against conventional norms in order to ostensibly progress human society, but how much do we give it up to individuals versus society itself to decide what are the worthy sacrifices that are necessary to be made in order for these revolutionary changes to be made.
Well, the other thing is that there's a second line where he actually points out that even back then, which is 1939.
Yeah, 39.
That already there was some kind of argument concerning the role of science and how certain individuals have taken science for profit.
We gave them wings to fly, and they rained death on us. We gave them a voice to be heard around the world, and they preach hatred to poison the minds of nations. Even the medicine we gave them to ease their pain is turned into a vice to enslave half mankind for the profit of a few.
And it's timely when you look at Moderna, and its ability to hold on to its vaccine,
its patents
from poorer countries,
not just
for
Moderna.
Profit margin, not just Moderna, but Moderna is the worst offender of all of them so far. But the point is that that's brought up, and it's amazing that in 1939 already people were formulating in their script writing those kinds of problems that arise from science for profit and for the few. And I thought that was quite interesting. It's just one or two lines, but it's interesting that it's even brought up. Aside from the other stuff is, how much science who is this science for, right? Who does it really benefit?
Exactly. Yeah. It's like there's this whole who watches the Watchmen element to
right.
it. It's like
the whole ethical aspect of it.
And
right?
And I was thinking, like, you as someone who has a background in the medical profession, like, you're not a surgeon, but you do, you teach gross medical anatomy. You're you yourself are enmeshed in the world of the medical sciences. And so I imagine this movie was quite interesting for you as an example of something that it's very pulpy ultimately in how the story is told, but it does seem that there is this, it is fascinating to look at it as in its own sort of, modest way as an earnest exploration of like what are the limits of what sort of credence we give to
It's
the
like,
medical sciences.
Sure, it's like when you take embryos and you genetically modify them, but the ethics of the worldwide ethics is that you can't have the embryos develop into babies. So that's, I mean, obviously ethics, this is very similar. The idea is that if you're going to make a person live for infinity, because you just go ahead and you put him on this extracorporeal kind of thing that he's the contraption, which really is just the artificial heart machine that we have now, right? Which you stop the heart, you go ahead and do your surgery on the heart, and then you start the machine up, and you jolt the heart back in place.
There's also this like you mentioned there, there's also this weirdly prescient, this prescience to the movie in terms of anticipating things that are actually going to happen, and obviously the movie itself is more, because it's a horror movie, the actual way it sort of expresses the ethical quandary is a lot more sort of over the top and in retrospect absurd than what actually happens. But there is that weird way in which the experience that Karloff's character goes through and the way he's treated by society does parallel ultimately the sort of does parallel what actually happens in terms of the controversies of the medical advances in medical science that do actually occur in reality, such as heart transplant surgery and the development of mechanical apparatuses for assisting
mechanical
surgery.
Assistance, yes.
Yeah. So let's just jump into the synopsis. So at his private home, an experimental surgeon named Dr. Henrik Savard, Boris Karloff, prepares to embark on a procedure that promises to revolutionize the medical profession. With the young medical student Bob Roberts, Stanley Brown, as an optimistic and willing test subject, Savard plans to put Roberts in a special deprivation tank in order to clinically put him to death using anesthesia, then drawing off heat in order to temporarily preserve the body and stave off decay. He will then employ an external mechanical heart he has designed with the help of an engineering assistant named Lang, Byron Folger, to resuscitate Roberts. It is Savard's ambition that the ability to clinically put patients to death, safely preserve their bodies, and then revive them with the mechanical heart will advance surgical procedures to the point where professionals will no longer be racing against time. Furthermore, he believes that his device will help unlock the potential for extending the life of individual patients to a virtually indefinite length.
Right.
Robert's fiancée and Savard's nurse, Betty Crawford, played by Anne Duran, is unable to stand the pressure and thus runs to alert the police. Lieutenant Shane, Don Bedeau, and police surgeon Dr. Stoddard, Joe DeStefani, arrive to find Roberts dead. With Lang having secreted his way out of the house with the mechanical heart, Savard admits to killing Roberts and is promptly arrested. At his trial, despite an impassioned appeal to the courtroom in the name of medical science and a stunning 60 hours of deliberation by the jury, Savard is found guilty of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. Releasing his body to Lang, Savard is then revived by his own device, and a few months later, jurors from his trial start being found dead in their homes by hanging. The reporter, Scoop Foley, played by Robert Wilcox, is hot on the case, having been at Savard's house the night he was arrested and becoming smitten with Savard's daughter, Janet, played by Lorna Gray. Looking up all the remaining jurors, Foley discovers that they've all been invited to Savard's house that night by Bowman, the judge who sentenced Savard, played by Charles Trowbridge. Arriving at Savard's house, Foley is just in time to meet Bowman, who reveals that he himself was invited there by Janet Savard. Bowman and Foley join the party, all having arrived in response to forged court orders. They include the district attorney Drake, who argued against Savard, played by Roger Pryor, Lieutenant Shane, Dr. Stoddard, Betty Crawford, and the three jurors who were the most eager to see Savard executed. Savard reveals himself, leading his guests into the dining room, where he gives each of the invited guests a card giving them the order in which he plans to have them killed and the exact time that they are to die. Bowman attempts to have Lieutenant Shane arrest Savard, but as he attempts to open a metal gate leading from the adjoining meeting room into the foyer, he is electrocuted. Savard secrets himself away into a secret room on the second floor of the house, speaking to his trapped victims through a speaker as he begins picking them off, adding jury foreman Clifford Kearney to the list of deceased and planning to move straight on to Betty Crawford. Just then, Janet Savard arrives and attempts to plead with her father for their lives, but instead he just locks her in a closet. The party attempts turning out the lights to hide themselves from Savard's gaze, but in an attempt to snipe Betty Crawford, Savard makes use of a shotgun with a flashlight fixed to the end. Fortunately for Betty, being a stickler for details, Savard waits until the clock chimes at Betty's appointed hour to die, which gives her just enough time to hide behind a chair while Lieutenant Shane fires back with his revolver. Distracted by Janet's protests, Savard frees her and encourages her to go, then announces to the party that he has changed his plans. Instead of killing the guests one by one, he plans to kill them off immediately. But rather than run away, Janet chooses to use her own life as a bargaining chip, threatening to touch the electrified gate unless her father frees the party. When he hesitates, she touches the gate, electrifies herself, collapsing as the electrical surge causes a blackout. When Savard rushes out from hiding to his daughter's assistance, Lieutenant Shane mortally wounds him with a shot from his revolver. Clinging to life, Savard convinces the party to help him use his technology to revive Janet. They restore Janet to life, Dr. Stoddard, Betty, and Foley taking her away. Lieutenant Shane and Drake leave to get an ambulance for Savard. Convinced that in the wrong hands his technology will only be used for evil, Savard destroys the mechanical heart with a couple of good bursts from his shotgun and promptly expires. I was listening to the audio commentary for the movie, which is done by these horror film scholars, Steve Jones and Kim Newman. And one thing they touch upon in their sort of looking at the film is the sort of way in which you can interpret this Mad Doctor film and the later Mad Doctor films that Boris Karloff is going to make for Columbia as kind of almost counterpoints to a very different kind of pulp story about scientists, by which we mean the hero doctor. And, you know, they specifically bring up examples like Dr. Kildare as an example, you know, of a scientist and a medical professional who uses his expertise not only to save lives in the medical field, but also, you know, to solve mysteries and, you know, help the police and all this other stuff. Right. So there is this, I think in The Man They Could Not Hang, you do see this interesting balance between the, you know, the obviousness that, like, there is this extent to which that Savard has a kind of megalomania. It's not so much that he has developed this very revolutionary technique. It's that he knows how revolutionary it is, and this, you know, there's this aspect to him, like even when he's giving that speech in the courtroom that you alluded to, where he's professing like his deep conviction, like of how much this technology is going to save and, you know, benefit humanity. There's this alternative aspect to it where it's like you really see in the same scene that it's no longer really about the medical science itself. It's the fact that he made it, that he's the one who is that he's like, you know, there's this aspect to it where it's like it's almost just as much about him making himself the vehicle of that change. That I guess to be
I don't know. I think that, I mean, all originators have that kind of thing. When Dvorak, I guess, did the first human heart, the automated human heart, which looks just like the contraption that he has. It was two pistons, but it wasn't.
Yeah, the artificial heart in this movie. Although I imagine that the Dvorak heart wasn't made with like glass vials. No. You know. It's like,
anyway, that was meant to be implanted in the person.
Right, and this one is a fully external device.
This is all external. This mainly puts the person suspended animation so that surgeons can work without the fear of the person dying while they're on the table because of the severity of the surgery.
Right. It's almost closer to a defibrillator, except a defibrillator is meant to stop circulation in order to cause an
and also to start it.
It restarts. It doesn't so much start it as it shocks the body into starting it itself. So it's almost more like that than it is like the internal artificial heart. But yeah, you do see like the strange prescience of this small little B movie in terms of concocting this idea for the story.
I don't see it as being megalomaniacal. What I see is a doctor that becomes deranged and now seeks vengeance, because his whole soliloquy at the end of the trial after being found guilty, he's allowed 2 minutes, and he just warns everybody,
Well, he's basically threatening them.
Exactly.
Like, I'm going to come back and I'm going to kill you all. Which, to me is that, like, that's not him going crazy. That's just like,
well, he's being spirited. Yeah.
Well, he's totally, he hasn't gone crazy. He's totally sane. He just has like a malicious, attitude towards anyone who's really standing in his way.
Yeah. And what's strange about it, he's trying to save life, but he ends up killing people. I mean, ultimately what he does after he's executed is like the purest fulfillment of exactly why he was executed in the first place. Because obviously he's saying, no, I only killed Roberts because I was going to revive him to do this experiment. But of course that doesn't matter in the court of law. All that matters is that you admitted that you willfully and knowingly and with premeditation killed somebody, and that's murder. And all of the high speaking, intellectualizing in the world isn't going to change that fact. Although I do think it's interesting that we do have a scene within the jury room where, and that's the interesting thing, like it's an interesting thing to put in the movie, to not just make it entirely about Savard, to actually put in the movie this element where you see the jury and you see them being conflicted, you see disagreement, and there are of course the people who end up being at Savard's house of horrors, the ones who end up being locked in the room, are the ones who are the most impassioned in arguing that he should be hung until dead, as opposed to all these these several other jurors who seem more conflicted and seem more of the opinion that maybe this guy isn't this isn't the right thing, maybe he shouldn't be have his life destroyed because like he seems to be convincing people that there was a worthwhile reason to sacrifice this person if it meant that society could progress. We have I never saw flatliners where you put person almost dead, right? And the brainwaves go. I never saw the movie. I guess Kevin Bacon's in that. I can't remember other people, but the idea is we get similar themes happening with this all the time in other movies, sort of like that. And the other thing is that the kinds of things that he uses to kill people. I think one of the interesting one was the poison phone with the that goes into the middle ear.
A barb in the phone that's poison,
which is reminiscent in the 1959 movie, Michael Gall's movie, Terror of the Black Museum. He creates devices that people die by in order to enhance the value of those pieces when he puts them in his museum. It's a very, very interesting movie.
I think it's Horrors of the Black Museum.
Horrors of the Black Museum.
Harry Cohen movie, a producer of the I Was a Teenage Werewolf. And
there he uses not a phone, but he uses a pair of binoculars with spikes, and a woman is just casually using them, and it goes right through to the back of her brain, and she dies, and then they end up, and so on and so forth. But the idea is that it's very interesting, the themes that you see 20 years earlier, right? So that's 59. This is 39. And you already, you see these, not that those themes are really, but you see people can borrow ideas from different films.
Right.
What I liked about this whole thing was the fact that it had some, it wasn't a straight procedural.
Right.
Like you mentioned before, like a trial and a police kind of procedural. It entailed a lot of other concepts and controversies, but also illustrated the craziness.
Right.
I call it crazy. If you're going to kill people, there are a couple of things that are wrong about the movies. You can't come back from a hanging because it severs the cord. So
right, it's not necessarily his. Well, I think Lang. It's acknowledged he does surgery on the neck.
Yes.
So
but the whole premise though is that he's technically dead after being hung.
Right, and of course it completely
It's not Igor, right? Igor broke his neck, but they didn't manage to sever his cord.
The thing that's more important in the case of the movie is that is a plot hole, because it's established in the opening sequence that the procedure can only work if you're able to preserve the body somehow. So,
right, I understand. I get
Savard's been decaying for several hours, so there's really even less guarantee that Lang is going to be able to...
Right, he even says that. Doesn't he say it's hard to get the circulation going with the artificial thing? I had to really jazz it up. Remember?
Okay, so that's the interesting thing. Is
you get through rigor mortis, right?
Which is nice, because it shows that Karl Brown as a screenwriter is actually thinking through these things. He's remembering stuff he established. There's a respectability
of continuity.
Which you don't often see in films of this kind, which shows that there was an investment of the filmmakers in the idea that, like, all right, let's try to. We know what Columbia wants. They want a pot boiler pulp story about a mad scientist, but let's try to do it something that at least for the audience can still be maintained within a certain idea of realism, of a certain... And
it has all the elements of those kinds of films in that era, which are the gangster and procedurals, black and white films.
Right.
It brought all those things together, and I thought that was very interesting. And like I said, Karloff does a really good job. And I'm kind of amazed, because you never really get... you never really get him doing that much dialogue in movies like this one. And he really pulls it off, maybe because he's the star, but the other people aren't really fleshed out. The kind of project, or the kind of what I would call the drawback of the film, is that you don't get anything really developed with the other characters. So
they're more or less props for him too.
It's like Agatha Christie, but even then, it's one of those killers on a train. So
I mean, I think for Karloff's performance, I think for him, like, this was just a better type of performance, because here he was able to play a villain, but where there's a certain amount of moral complexity. This is a villain he's not a villain just because, it's not like in previous films he did where he's a villain either because he's just like a megalomaniacal person who wants to conquer things or whatever, like in Fu Manchu. He's not just someone who's deranged. He really is someone who thinks that he's doing the right thing and is ultimately transformed by his... or whether he's transformed, or whether the experience of being made to die for his beliefs sort of brings out a sort of misanthropy that was always embedded in his...
That's right. That's exactly the best. That is the best way to say it. Exactly the way you said it. Yes, I agree with that. The other thing I like, who's the writer again that did this?
Karl Brown.
If you notice, even at the scene where they arrest him and he's trying to wake up Ann Doran's, Betty Crawford's boyfriend, who's also was
Rogers,
Rogers.
Bob Rogers.
There's a
very original name. Bob Rogers.
There's a sequence, remember, where he's imploring them to let him try, and there's almost a point where you think maybe they're going to agree.
Right.
And I thought that was a beautifully written scene. For as short as it was, there was this tension that it isn't simply come arrest him, you don't understand, and then him begging and they're pulling him off. There's a temporary heightened kind of what do you call it? Expectation, if you will. Hey, maybe they're gonna let him bring what so and so back.
Well, that's the thing. Is like for us as spectators, we're introduced to him as a character who has no malicious intent, and who Bob Rogers himself has absolute and utter faith in.
Right.
So even if
he's betrayed the faith, right?
So we as spectators are put into the position where we're like those jurors who are sitting there who say, well, he doesn't seem like such a bad guy to be. Maybe he really can do this, and we're stopping him, and we shouldn't stop him. So you're put in this very interesting situation where you want him to do the procedure. even regardless, and of course that's the thing, we don't know if it'll work or not. We don't see the procedure working until Lang does it some 20 minutes into the movie.
Right.
So there is that.
But the other thing is that
in
a jury, if I'm not mistaken, they even raised that point. I thought the continuity of the script. And you bring up more stuff all the time. Even in the discussion and when they're deliberating, they say, well, he didn't really kill him. They stopped him from saving him. I mean, that was part of the argument of whether or not they were going to convict him of murder. And then finally, the histrionic ones that really want him to get killed. And there's a certain element of pleasure in condemning him.
Right.
Because he tread too far to the... You see that all the time. I mean,
but that's the thing, is that like they're not treating him like a simple a murderer who just needs to be sort of hanged because these are the facts as we know it. There's like a deep sort of pathological social fear of who he is and what he represents. It's a veritably Randian scene. There's all because it's almost reminiscent to me of The Fountainhead or some other sort of libertarian fantasy where there is that opposition that's created between this sort of strong, hyper individual, this new man who is unbound by any sort of social constraints and who is so individually motivated, versus this depiction of the most sort of regressive, and fearful sort of caricature of human nature. And I think that's part of the thing about The Man That They Could Not Hang, is that it's a weird example of again, as we referred to before, it's the weird example of one of these pot boiler B movies that is gesturing at something that seems actually, that is not just in terms of the technological prescience of the film, not just in terms of the fact that at the end of the day, the science that the character is employing in the movie is stuff that is going to be developed in the future.
Right, and you have the same, but that's what a jury is, right? It's 12 people,
right,
of different makes that all come and arrive at a decision, and so but the point is that yes, you have the same. Not blind is the wrong word, but you see it today. You see people that believe that science is bad and that science is treading in areas that it doesn't belong in, and so there's that element.
Yeah, there's this
too.
Social realism. There's this attention to how things work in social history.
And I just find it amazing. Again, since this is 1939, and we started. When was the film? When was the actual filming done? Do you know?
It was done in 1939. It was very quickly
so
made.
You're close to the fall of the Weimar Republic in Germany. You're getting these whole, all things happening in Europe at the time and things like that. So it's very interesting that you were able to generate a film like this, and they did. I thought the writers did. This is where the writers made the day. And also very good direction. I believe the photographer, some excellent shots, especially the scene in the beginning where they tried to surround the district attorney, I believe.
No, it's the jury foreman, Kearney. Because he's the next victim after Bowman's already been killed by the electrical grenade.
Right.
Yeah, they do, they surround him in a sort of circle that they're just going. And I think that's also interesting about the way Brown writes the story, is that, like you say, we don't really learn a lot about this character, but there is this sort of element to it where it's that there is a kind of ingeniousness to the way the plot is written, because having the characters not just be a bunch of people who are constantly at each other's necks and who are easily being picked off. That's the interesting thing, is that ultimately, at the end of the day, Savard seems to be a very brilliant doctor. He is a very poor murderer, apparently. Because at the end, he puts together this entire elaborate system. He's drawing upon his knowledge of science in order to make his house into this giant death trap. But at the end of the day, at least in the film proper, he only manages to kill... Right. At the house itself, he only manages to kill 2 people. He kills at least 6 jurors off screen.
Right, and also... Brian Folger, Lang, he kills off screen as well.
Right, but they all seem to die the exact same way, because they're all found hung. So it's so basically, if he had just done what he was originally doing, which is just pick them off,
There wouldn't be any story, though.
Yeah, there wouldn't be. And that's the thing, is that, like, yeah, he's reserving his deepest hate for the people that he feels the most personal animosity to. But yeah, after, so we see Bowman and Kearney, and basically that's it. Two people are killed on screen in this film, and because he's and that's the great thing about the part where he is about to kill Betty Crawford, but he waits until the chime of her death.
Then she hides.
Yeah, like in the time it's taking him to do it. It's like, yeah, she just hides behind a sofa chair,
right, big one,
and he does it, and he can't get to her,
right,
and it's just like, well, it's a sort of interesting dynamic.
Well, he's a great doctor, but he's not a very good killer.
Well, right, but the reason he's not a very good killer is because he needs the entire theater of the murder.
Right.
Like,
yes.
He needs it to be so exact and perfectly timed, which is, interestingly enough, like, it sort of relates back to what he says about his exact reasons for making the device. Like, in the courtroom scene, and in or it might have been in an earlier scene, he talks about that whole idea that, like, look, modern surgery is always a race against time. You basically have a very small window of time in which you can put your patient under anesthesia. You can go into the body. You need to make the alterations you need to make. And all the while, you need to be aware that the clock is constantly ticking before you either deliver so much anesthesia that they expire, or there's only so long that you can have, like, you be working on an open body before you're going to cause inevitable damage or risk that person's life. Here, I'm taking time totally out of the equation. I'm giving the doctor, like, basically infinitum to work their magic. So it's interesting that, like, his downfall in the climax of the movie is entirely his inability to respect time. That, like, he's locking himself into this rubric of, this needs to occur at this point, this needs to occur at this point.
Right. That all gets thrown out the window. The first two do work. Well,
right.
No, because correct me if I'm wrong. So they're circling around Dick Curtis, jury foreman, right?
Yeah, Kearney, yeah.
Right. But they break the circle, they answer the phone. So whoever picked up the phone was killed, right?
Foley answers the phone. He doesn't get killed.
Oh, no, he hands
the phone because because it's one of Kearney's business associates, and then it turns out it's just, like, Karloff messing up.
I mean, it has not a comical element. It's like, but it is kind of funny. I mean,
right.
I mean, not to me, it wasn't funny at the time. But again, it's the writer giving some kind of suspense to it. Well, is Curtis' character going to be killed or not?
Well,
and it's intricate. You break the circle. Start. All right, I'll go answer the phone. No, it's your friend. Come over.
Yeah, it's also another interesting pattern, because it's another interesting thing that Brown works into the script, which is that Savard is always telling his victims not to do the thing that is going to kill them. Because, and it's a great little character point, because because he knows that they're going to do the thing that kills them, because he's that much of an expert in predicting basically the sort of natural ignorance of human behavior.
Or the hubris.
People he thinks.
No.
Yeah. So, but that's the thing, is that, like, he knows these people are intellectually beneath him, but he also needs to rub it in their face right before they die. It's like and that's the thing that, like, there's the sadism and glee with which he's doing what he's doing. Again, it sort of points to the ultimate, like, the sort of quandary at the center of the film, which is that, like, was Savard ever such a great person, or was he one of these many sort of narcissistic people who had merely found a socially acceptable means of sublimating his deep, misanthropy?
Well, yeah, but you never know. You never know whether or not that, if he were successful, that any of this would surface. How many people walk the face of the earth that don't emerge, don't go through a transformation just because they're lucky that the particular incident does not trigger that. You're right, and I think that's one of the elements that this movie shows. Is it deep-seated or not? Maybe, but the idea is, I don't think it crosses his mind earlier. I think it crosses his mind after he's betrayed, and also then condemned to death, and then it clicks.
Yeah,
and the hanging didn't help.
Yeah, but like that's the thing. Yeah, like there, and that's what I mean about the almost Randian nature of his character. And I think like there is that element to like and all mad doctors are like that in the
Yes,
sort
they
of
are.
in the sort of conventional
Even
mad.
Bela Lugosi in the movie you just mentioned before,
The Raven.
The Raven.
Yeah, in all mad.
But there he had a love interest, wasn't that part of the thing that was driving it? Right.
Yeah. But like that's the thing in all mad in the sort of in sort of the typical mad doctor movie, it sort of goes back to what Sontag wrote in the imagination of disaster, where she's talking about how like there's this, and she was writing that in the context of the 50s and 60s science fiction movie.
Right,
but
that's right.
We can still see it here in the sort of origins of the Mad Doctor movie, which is the idea that there is a very clear line being drawn between scientists and doctors, and scientists are bad because they're liable to crack up. They're people, they hold themselves off in their own sort of egocentric, solipsistic worlds that they claim is about advancement, but at any moment they're very much just teetering on the edge of their own obsessions and going completely crazy because what they do is so unorthodox and necessarily outside of the norm of human psychology, where all the good people, the good scientists are all practical, medical, like practical practitioners. They're all like, doctors. They're all people who have very
scientists are different, right?
Yeah, scientists are a different breed because they have to imagine, and so they have to go outside of the norm.
Right.
Yeah, but and that's the
but
thing.
But he's the doctor too. I mean, he's not just a scientist; he's a doctor scientist, right? He's both.
Well, that's the thing. I think he's an experimental doctor. I mean, it's we don't ever see his practice. I mean, it's like this isn't like a Val Lewton movie where we're seeing like that level of social realism. This is really more of like it's a much more But that's the interesting thing, is that it is a very rhetorical film by its very nature. That where Brown as a writer does seem very earnestly invested in like trying to create an allegory out of it. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, like, because it's just an hour-long movie, the only way he can really give expression to that is through explicit rhetoric, through dialogue, whether it's in Savard acknowledging both in the courtroom scene and then later at the climax of the movie where he's talking to his daughter, Janet, basically admitting that, like, progress in science is always turned by intellectually inferior human beings into means of destruction, which but that's the same thing. It's like it's the sort of same pathology where it's like it's not me who is, pushing over this domino and causing this cascading effect where I have not looked into the ethical ramifications of what I'm doing. It's it's the dummies, it's the ignorant rubes out there. Or there's another very interesting sort of rhetorical exchange. And again, that's the thing that's so interesting about making like the first 20 minutes of the movie like a courtroom drama, is that there's a lot of room for like actual rhetoric and engaging with the sort of speculative ideas of this science fiction allegory, because you will have Savard, from his own perspective, saying something that is thoroughly benign and even progressive, like when he says like about, with this technology, we'll be able to like take the, the still youthful organs of like a young athlete who has died untimely, and we'll be able to give it to like some great elder genius so that he can prolong his own life. And then, it only takes the district attorney, Drake, like a few seconds to point up that, like, it's utterly insane that, like, even in your grandest dreams of, like, what your technology can be used for, the thing that you immediately leap to is that, like, the youth can be sacrificed so that, like, this intellectually superior older person can just live forever. So, like, there is that aspect to it where it's like, we see...
Well, he just turned the table on him. That's all he did. And also he said, you did kill him, didn't you? He goes,
right.
Yeah, that's all I need.
Well, that's the thing. It's like he turned the table on him, but he pointed out something
right.
true. It's like, this is literally what you did. You sacrificed Bob Roberts so that you could extend maybe not your physical life but your legacy. And it's like, and that's the thing, is like the very specific like sort of hypothetical scenario he uses is one that obviously has ramifications for himself. The idea that he's working on these things. It's like, okay, so are you working on this sort of unorthodox experiment because you really think that there is a great progressive potential of extending human life and improving the quality of human life? Or are you doing it because you yourself are fearful of death? Because you yourself want to be the one who lives forever? It's like, I think that's part of the reason why the movie works the way it does, is because there is this great rhetorical battle of wills that's going on at the heart of it, where you can acknowledge the sympathetic aspects of Savard while also acknowledging the sort of like you have like a really weird pathology of why you want to do these things. And
It turns it around, makes it less than what it is, only because he cites that as an example.
Right.
This body, this mechanism means nothing. The mind is all that counts. But when the body dies, the mind dies with it. But this we can prevent. Think of it. The Edison or the Pasteur of tomorrow need not die merely because his heart is worn out. We'll give him a new heart, taken perhaps from the body of a young man who's been killed in an automobile accident. And our great genius is awakened to another 60 years of useful life.
Counsel for the defense is asking you to free Dr. Savard because he killed in the name of science, for a high and noble purpose, for humanity. In Dr. Savard's own statement, stripped of its fine phrases and reduced to its actual meaning, it means we're to butcher our young athletes so their hearts can be used to prolong the life of some doddering old man, preferably a scientist. I assure you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Dr. Savard's fine ideal would never be permitted in any civilized country. And yet he wants you to set him free so he can continue that kind of experimentation. He wants you to license him to kill young men and women. He wants you to suspend the law and give him the right to go on committing murder without fear of punishment.
And that's the thing, is like, it's one of those things, like you talk about how, like, yeah, throughout the history of medical science, you always have this sort of you have these moments of reaction against, even something like the first heart transplant. Like there was, because even in like and we're not even necessarily, and that's the thing where like there's a sort of limit to the sort of the sort of allegorical mad science narrative, where very often mad science narratives show a situation in which sort of experimental, usually medical science, is placed in opposition to what can, for lack of a better term, be defined as like the normal world, the world of like, just regular plebeian people who just want to go about their regular lives and who don't want to have the world sort of shaken up and interrupted by these profound advancements that they're going to have no control over. That's how it's sort of depicted in movies and in fiction. But in the actual world of scientific progress, a lot of these controversies really do happen within the sphere of the medical sciences. Like, like even with something like the first heart transplant, it wasn't there was partially a controversy of like the public reaction against it, like whether it's ethical to, mess around with the human heart, or whether you're like, are you like going against God by like tampering with something that is so essential to human life? But it wasn't just that, the public controversy. There was controversy within the medical profession itself, because it's like, wait, doesn't this necessarily, as all surgery would, doesn't the fact that we're doing harm to the body to try to save the body, inherent contradictions of the oath we take as medical practitioners to...
Well, you're not killing anybody.
Right, you're not killing anybody, but you know what I mean.
But do no harm.
Yeah, exactly. Within the medical profession, these controversies occur all the time.
Right.
It's not a one-to-one between there's the medical world and then there's there's the regular plebeian world. It's like, no, within the medical world, there's always people who are like, yeah, this is... You gotta rein this back. We need to have the ethical discussion.
It's like Blaylock when he did the heart surgery to correct the heart defects in babies, right? So at the time, the heart is something you do not touch. Was the medical accepted rule, but he changed that.
Right. Yeah.
And at the time, there was some controversy. Maybe you're going to play like. Priest would come in, so maybe you're going too far. Maybe you're treading.
You knock the domino over, and where does the where does the pat end?
So it's
well, obviously you shake your head, but like you're like the mad doctor in this situation. You're like
no, I'm not mad doctor. But the point is that I understand. I get it. I mean, I understand both sides. Actually, I get the point where, And
that's the thing that's great about I think The Man They Could Not Hang is that it
shows both sides to
exactly.
That, right?
Yeah, like so
all the facets.
You get the side where you earnestly sympathize with Savard, and you're like, man, like the sort of reactionary nature of the status quo really did prevent this man who could only do what he did if he were unfettered by conventional restrictions, which to a certain extent we all feel just a little bit of sympathy for just on a base level. Like, man, I wish I wasn't restricted and really pursuing my own interests. I wish I didn't have to think about social consequences much. I wish I could just do what I wanted to do. But so you have that side where we earnestly sympathize with him, and we see like, this sort of, we sympathize with this sort of libertarian allegory where it's like, yeah, like society by its very nature is reactionary and it inhibits the individual from doing great things that can actually make society better. But then we see the opposite end of that. We see the obverse end of it where we then we recognize and we sympathize with what I think I've referred to it in the past as scientophobia, the irrational fear of scientific advancement, where it's like here we look at Savard in one scene and we see a sympathetic character, but then as the story progresses, we realize, okay, so there's an extent to which you are just nakedly rewarding the irrational fear of scientific advancement. You are becoming the boogeyman that all of these people are so are so afraid of. And that's what makes it such an interesting movie, I think, in the annals of the mad science movie, is that, that you do see, well, I guess it comes down to something as simple as there's character development. Like the characters aren't, Dr. Savard isn't just frozen in one type. He progresses from one person into another. He's changed over the course of the film.
There's no indication that he's going to, what is he going to do after he gets done killing all these people?
Right.
And it's, I don't know, and you don't get any indication of that, right? It looks like maybe he just feels like he's going to go down with a flame, and having killed everybody, that at some point he's going to have to kill himself because the fact that he's accomplished of his vengeance, or because of retribution, and now what?
I mean, I think that's and I guess that's the one area of the plot where, again, it's a problem of motivation. You really have to wonder. It's like, because that's the thing is maybe it doesn't really matter what he would do after within the limited purview of the movie if he were successful at killing all these people. But from a character perspective, it matters because he's supposed to be this guy who has this very forward-facing mentality, and yet when Judge Bowman tells him, look, you're not going to get away with doing this to us, and he's like, he brushes it off with something as simple as well, technically I'm already dead,
right? So
I can't be charged with anything. I can't be found guilty. So it's like, okay, what are you just going to fly away to Jamaica? You're going to just rest out your days. He doesn't seem like the guy who would who would run away to live out his sunset years in quiet anonymity. That doesn't seem like something.
No, but the other thing is that kind of at the end, it's kind of funny that he cops out and destroys the machine. It's part of his psychopathy, if you will. That I'm the only one that deserves this.
Yeah, not a psychopathy, but definitely a megalomania.
Yeah, well, regardless,
it's like
The idea is that he says, "Oh, if I can't have it, I can see it two ways. One, he says, this is causing too much danger. I've mended my ways. I saved my daughter. I'm going to finish this machine because it's not good for science." I don't know. I don't think you buy that. There's something about the end that suggests that he is selfish.
That he's taking away the key to humanity's progress.
Couple glass things,
right? Exactly. Well, just because you're right. I think you're absolutely right. Is that
there's something about that ending that bothers me? It's just why destroy the machine? Why not just die?
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think that's the thing too. Is that I think that's something that the film doesn't really put a point on very well, which is why does he destroy the machine?
Yeah.
But the thing you're proposing is actually, because from my interpretation, I thought it was that weird thing where the conflict I was having, where it's I thought the reason he destroyed the machine was something related to what he was saying to Janet about how progress in science is always turned by ignorant rubes toward nefarious ends. So I thought he was destroying the machine
just so it wouldn't get used for nefarious ends. Right.
But I think, but then I just think, well, from his perspective in the movie, it has literally never been used for nefarious ends. So I think your interpretation is much more compelling. That this is his last stab at society, that this is the nail in the nail in the coffin of what his actual legacy is as a character. Is okay, you never really cared about progress. This was all about you, and if you can't have the legacy,
right? And it's hard to tell on Karloff's face what he's doing at that point. It almost looks like it's not ambivalent. It looks like he's just going to do it before he dies.
Right, because at that point...
Destroy it.
Yeah, at this point, Dr. Stoddard is still alive, the police surgeon. He's still alive. Back in the beginning of the movie, when he explains what he's going to do with the machine, with the artificial heart, Stoddard, is just oh, that's fantastic. It could never be done. But then once Stoddard sees what can be done... then he's the last person by Savard's side as he just dies in a wheelchair, and the last line of the movie is, "Why did you destroy it?" So I think that is a very interesting punctuation to put on it, where you have a character who was against Savard originally, but who becomes converted once he sees the power that this machine holds. But and then
he says, "Well, if I can't enjoy it with you or with other scientists, then I'm going to destroy it." As if they can't make it again.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think but there's an ambiguity to it, certainly. But yeah, I think that was a good place to put a cap on it. We'll be coming back again with the second of the Columbia Mad Doctor movies starring Boris Karloff, the second of 5. When we come back, we'll be doing The Man with 9 Lives. So stay tuned.
Okay.
So stay tuned for the. Despite the title of the
movie,
I don't
know. I never saw it.
Despite the title of the movie, spoiler alert: he does not. He doesn't die 9 times in the movie. But yes, join us next time on Monster Craze Memoirs.